Elon Musk stood outside his old high school, staring up at the familiar building that had been the backdrop to his teenage years. It was an odd feeling, being back here after all this time. He had come to visit a few old friends, maybe even catch a glimpse of the people who had shaped his early life in ways he hadn't even realized. A tour of his past, if you will. But there was something about the place that made him feel like a stranger in his own skin, a piece of him lost in the distance of time. As he walked through the halls, the echoes of old memories seemed to come alive. The science classrooms where he had first started building his wild ideas, the cafeteria where he and his friends had spent hours debating the future of technology, the locker room where he had grown from a quiet, nerdy kid to someone who believed he could change the world. It was all here, in pieces, reminding him of who he had been. But it was something unexpected that caught his attention as he passed the janitor's closet. The faint sound of a broom sweeping the floor, the rhythmic swish of it moving back and forth, stopped him in his tracks. He had not planned on it, but he turned and walked towards the small closet. And there, right in front of him, was someone he hadn't seen in years. A man hunched over, pushing a broom across the hallway. His back was slightly bent, his hair completely gray, but there was something about him that felt deeply familiar. It took a moment, but then it hit him. "Mr. Thompson." Elon's voice was soft, hesitant. He couldn't believe it. The man had barely changed, despite the obvious signs of age. The janitor, who had worked tirelessly at the school for as long as Elon could remember, turned around with a look of surprise, his old eyes lighting up in recognition. "Elon. Is that really you?" Mr. Thompson's voice trembled with a mixture of shock and joy. His smile was warm, genuine, but there was a sadness in his eyes that immediately struck Elon. The last time he had seen Mr. Thompson, he had been just another figure in the background of his life. A person who was always there, quietly doing his job, but never the center of attention. Elon smiled, his mind racing with memories of his high school years. "I can't believe you're still here, still working after all this time. You were always so kind to me." Mr. Thompson chuckled softly, leaning on his broom. "Well, someone's got to keep this place in order." His voice had a rough quality to it now, worn by the years, but it was still the same voice that had greeted Elon with a nod every day after class. Elon's mind started to turn. It wasn't just that Mr. Thompson had been a constant presence at the school, it was that he was still here, still working, even though he had to be nearing 80. "You know, it's been a long time since I've seen you. I thought you would have retired by now," Elon said, trying to keep the conversation light, but the words felt heavy as they hung in the air. Mr. Thompson shrugged, an almost sheepish expression crossing his face. "Well, I never really had the chance to retire. Things were tight for me, even after all these years. But someone's got to pay the bills, right?" There was a moment of silence between them. Elon felt the weight of the words. This was the man who had worked hard all his life, doing a job that most people overlooked, and now, at an age when most people would have been enjoying their golden years, Mr. Thompson was still at it. It was a sobering thought. "What happened?" Elon asked, his curiosity piqued. "I mean, you worked here for so long. Wasn't there a time when you could have just stopped? Or, you didn't want to?" Mr. Thompson sighed, leaning his broom against the wall. His old hands rubbed his temples as he looked down at the floor. "It wasn't always easy, Elon. Life doesn't always give you a chance to stop and take a break. I had a family to take care of, bills to pay, and dreams that never quite came true. When I retired, I thought I could finally relax, maybe travel, or do something for myself. But, well, you know how it goes. Things don't always go as planned." Elon stood there, staring at him, trying to process the weight of Mr. Thompson's words. It was a reality check, one he hadn't expected. Here he was, standing in front of a man who had given so much of his life to a job that had never asked for thanks, never offered recognition. And yet, he was still here, still working, still sweeping the same halls where Elon once wandered as a teenager. There was something deeply moving about it. The truth hit Elon hard. Here was a man who had spent a lifetime in service to others, and yet, he had never achieved the recognition or success that he deserved. He had been invisible to most people, just a fixture in the background of school life, doing the hard work that no one ever noticed. But Elon did notice. Mr. Thompson, Elon's voice faltered for a moment as he struggled to find the right words. I had no idea. I'm sorry. I had no idea that you were still here, still working. The old janitor gave a slow smile, as if he appreciated Elon's sincerity. It's all right, son. You've gone on to do big things. I'm just doing my part. But Elon couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that settled over him. The thought of Mr. Thompson, still working at 80, was hard to bear. He had known this man as a quiet figure, always in the background, always working hard without any fanfare. But now, standing here, Elon realized just how much he had underestimated the impact of someone like Mr. Thompson. This wasn't just a story about a man doing his job, it was a story about sacrifice, about perseverance, and about the people who go unnoticed in the world, yet play such an important role in shaping the lives of others. As he stood there, looking at Mr. Thompson, Elon knew that this moment would stick with him. This was the beginning of something. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he felt a stirring in his chest, a desire to do something for this man who had given so much to the world without ever asking for anything in return. Mr. Thompson, Elon said, a new sense of determination in his voice, I want to help you. I want to make sure you get the recognition and support you deserve. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, looking at Elon with curiosity. What do you mean, Elon? Elon smiled, a spark of resolve in his eyes. You'll see. I'll make sure your story is heard. And I'll make sure you don't have to work like this forever. This was just the beginning. Elon Musk had always been someone who thrived on challenges, someone who believed in making the impossible happen. But now, he was on the cusp of something much bigger than just a business venture. This was about people, real, everyday people, and making sure they weren't forgotten. The next steps would not only change Mr. Thompson's life, but could very well change the way Elon viewed success, ambition, and the impact of those who work tirelessly in the background. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As Elon sat in the small, dimly lit room with Mr. Thompson, the weight of the past seemed to settle between them. The hallway outside was silent, almost as though the school itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to say something, anything, that might give meaning to this strange reunion. Elon hadn't expected this conversation to take such a turn, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he knew about the man standing before him. It was almost as though Mr. Thompson had been a shadow in his life, always there but never truly seen. So, Mr. Thompson, how did you end up here? Elon asked, leaning forward, genuinely curious. I mean, I can't imagine it was always like this. Did you always want to be a janitor? Mr. Thompson chuckled, but it was a sound tinged with the bittersweet weight of time. No, son, I didn't always want to be a janitor. In fact, when I was your age, I had big dreams, just like you. I wanted to be an architect. I loved drawing, building, imagining things. But life doesn't always go as planned, does it? Elon leaned back in his chair, feeling a pang of empathy for the man before him. There it was, the invisible weight of life's disappointments that so many people carried but never spoke of. He'd spent so much of his own life chasing the stars, dreaming of Mars, of electric cars and artificial intelligence, of changing the world. But hearing Mr. Thompson's story, it reminded him that not everyone's path to success was paved with grand ambitions and opportunities. Some people, like Mr. Thompson, were forced to take a different road entirely. I didn't grow up with a lot, Mr. Thompson continued, his voice steady but filled with the kind of quiet strength that came only from years of survival. My family had a small house on the outskirts of town. My dad worked 2 jobs, my mom took care of the house. We didn't have much, but we made do. I went to school here, just like you. But things were different back then. Opportunities were scarce. Elon nodded, understanding all too well how the environment you grew up in could shape your dreams and aspirations. In some ways, it felt like the world had given up on Mr. Thompson before he even had a chance to dream big. When I graduated high school, Mr. Thompson continued, I had plans. I was going to go to college, get a degree in architecture, and build things that would stand the test of time. But life had other plans. My family needed me. My dad got sick, and my mom couldn't manage everything on her own. I took a job at the local hardware store to help out. Then, after my dad passed, I had to take care of my mom. College was no longer an option. Elon listened intently, his heart heavy with understanding. That must have been tough, he said, his voice quiet. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to give up everything for the sake of family. Elon's own journey had been marked by fierce independence and a singular focus on his goals, but here was a man who had sacrificed his dreams for the people he loved. Mr. Thompson smiled, but it was a smile that carried both pride and regret. It wasn't easy, no. But it was the right thing to do. You do what you have to do to get by, and that's what I did. I worked at the hardware store for a while, then I found this job at the school. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills. And it kept me close to the community. I've been here ever since. Elon stared at him, feeling the weight of his words settle in. It was hard to fathom, really. Mr. Thompson had spent decades doing the same thing, quietly working in the background, never asking for much, never complaining. In a way, it seemed like his life had been on pause, his own dreams and ambitions forgotten, while he dedicated himself to the well-being of others. But you still never stopped dreaming, right? Elon asked, leaning in. I mean, even though you had to take on this job, I can't imagine you just gave up on your passion completely. Mr. Thompson's eyes softened as he looked down at the floor, a nostalgic expression crossing his face. Oh, I still dreamed. I always did. Even when I was working here, I'd still draw plans, sketch ideas, think about what I could have built. But, you know, dreams are funny things. They start out big and bright, but as time goes on, they get smaller. At some point, you realize they're not going to come true. And you start to adjust. You learn to be content with what you have. Life moves on, and you have to move with it. Elon's heart ached at those words. He could see the man before him, the quiet, hard-working janitor who had always been a fixture of his high school days, not as an old man doing a menial job, but as someone who had once had hopes and aspirations, someone who had believed in something bigger for himself. Elon was no stranger to the crushing weight of disappointment. He had faced his own setbacks, his own struggles. But his path had always been one of relentless pursuit, he had never let go of his dreams. For Mr. Thompson, it seemed that those dreams had slipped through his fingers, one small sacrifice at a time. You know, Elon began, his voice full of realization, I never really thought about what happens to the people who aren't in the spotlight. The ones who work behind the scenes, who don't get the recognition. I always took it for granted. Mr. Thompson gave a knowing smile. Most people do. And that's all right. We don't do this job for recognition. We do it because it needs to be done. But I'll tell you one thing, Elon, you're one of the lucky ones. You got to chase your dreams, build your empire. Some of us never get that chance. Elon's thoughts raced. He had never been forced to give up his dreams, never had to settle for less than what he believed he could achieve. But hearing Mr. Thompson's story made him realize just how fortunate he had been. And in that moment, he made a vow to himself. He wasn't going to let Mr. Thompson's story slip through the cracks of time. He wasn't going to let this man's life be just another forgotten narrative. "Mr. Thompson, I can't change what happened in the past. But I can do something about the future. You've given so much, and now it's my turn to help make sure you get what you deserve." The old janitor's eyes widened with surprise, but there was also a glimmer of hope in them. He had lived most of his life quietly, without expectation. But now, standing before Elon Musk, he saw something different in the young billionaire's eyes, something genuine, something that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over after all. This was just the beginning. Elon Musk had come back to his old high school, but he was about to embark on a journey that would change not only Mr. Thompson's life but his own. As he stood there, in the small, quiet room with the janitor who had worked tirelessly for decades, Elon felt a new sense of purpose awaken inside him, a purpose that would take him far beyond the realms of technology and business, into a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. The idea had taken root in Elon's mind during his conversation with Mr. Thompson, but it was only the beginning. As Elon left the school and drove back to his office, he couldn't stop thinking about the janitor's life. Every word Mr. Thompson had spoken echoed in his mind, the sacrifices, the lost dreams, the resignation that had settled over him like a blanket. It struck him that this man had given so much of himself to a job that many people would never even notice. And here he was, at the age of 80, still toiling away, making sure the school was kept clean for others, but never having the opportunity to build anything of his own. Elon had seen firsthand how powerful dreams could be, how they could change the world. He had built Tesla from the ground up, defied odds, and created something that had the potential to change humanity's future. But now, as he sat in his sleek office overlooking the city, he realized that there were people who had dreams just as powerful, just as big as his own, and yet, they had never had the opportunity to pursue them. They had never had the resources, the support, or the time. They had been stuck, just like Mr. Thompson. It wasn't just about helping one person, it was about something bigger. About giving back to those who had never been given the tools to succeed. The janitor's story was a powerful reminder of all the people in the world who never had the privilege of chasing their dreams, who had been forced to make do with whatever life handed them. But that didn't sit right with Elon. He wasn't a man who accepted the status quo. And as much as he had been an architect of innovation, now, he would be an architect of change in another way. He would use his resources to help those who had been left behind. And that meant starting with Mr. Thompson. As Elon stared out over the city, his mind raced with possibilities. He began to formulate a plan, one that would not only help Mr. Thompson but would also shine a light on the plight of countless others like him. It wasn't just about giving someone a job or a retirement plan, it was about giving them the chance to build a legacy, to live a life that wasn't defined by the daily grind, but by their own ambitions and passions. Elon called his team together the next day. He knew that to make this work, he needed a plan. He needed resources, people, and above all, he needed a way to move fast. The longer Mr. Thompson stayed on the sidelines, the more time would be lost. He was already 80 years old, and Elon wasn't going to let that time go to waste. "I have a project I want us to take on," Elon began, addressing his team. "It's not a business venture. It's not a product launch. It's something bigger. Something that's about helping people who've been overlooked by the world, people who work in the shadows, people like Mr. Thompson." He explained how he had met the janitor at his old high school and how hearing Mr. Thompson's story had opened his eyes to something he had never fully understood before. He spoke about the man's dreams, the sacrifices he had made, and how he was still working in his 80s, quietly doing his job, without anyone noticing. "I want to change that," Elon said, his voice firm. "I want to give Mr. Thompson, and others like him, the chance to live a life they deserve. We're going to do something big. We're going to make sure people like him don't just fade into the background. We're going to give them the resources, the opportunities, and the recognition they deserve." The room fell silent. Elon had always been a man of bold ideas, but this one was different. This wasn't about revolutionizing an industry or creating a new technology. This was about people. It was about humanity. And it was going to be difficult. Mr. Thompson's dream was always to be an architect, Elon continued. And even though he's been stuck in this job for decades, I believe there's still a spark in him. We're going to make sure that spark can grow into a fire. But we can't just throw money at it. We need to give him the support he needs to get back on his feet, to rediscover his passion, and to bring his ideas to life. The team exchanged glances. This wasn't a typical project. It wasn't a product they could sell, and there wouldn't be a direct financial return. But there was something in Elon's voice, a quiet fire, a deep passion, that made them believe in the cause. We'll need architects, designers, contractors. One of Elon's top advisors, Sarah, spoke up. And we'll need to ensure that the project isn't just about the physical structure. If we want to give him a chance, we need to invest in his education, his skills, and his mental health too. It's going to take time. Elon nodded. Exactly. This isn't going to be easy, but we're going to take it one step at a time. And I want to make sure Mr. Thompson feels like this is his dream, his legacy, not just something we're doing for him. The team quickly began discussing the details, how to get Mr. Thompson back into education, how to provide the resources he needed, and how to balance his mental and emotional well-being while embarking on this journey. But even as the wheels started turning, Elon couldn't shake the feeling that there would be a lot more obstacles ahead. This wasn't just about giving a man the tools to build his dream, it was about changing the way society viewed people who had been overlooked for so long. The project would be full of challenges, some logistical, some personal, but Elon was ready. After all, his entire career had been defined by the willingness to take risks, to challenge the impossible, and to push the boundaries of what could be done. And if there was one thing he knew, it was that he didn't shy away from a challenge. As the meeting ended and everyone began to disperse, Elon stayed behind for a moment. He stared at the blueprints for his latest space project on the wall, but his mind was elsewhere, on a man he had barely known, a man whose dreams had been crushed by circumstances beyond his control. It was time to change that. It was time to give Mr. Thompson and people like him the chance to dream again. He picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Thompson's number, already planning his next steps. The first phase of this project would be the hardest, convincing Mr. Thompson to accept help. The janitor had spent decades living with the belief that his time for dreaming had passed. But Elon was determined to prove him wrong. When Mr. Thompson answered, Elon didn't waste any time. Mr. Thompson, I need you to trust me. I'm going to help you build your dream. And we're going to do it together. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a quiet, almost hesitant voice replied, Elon, I don't know what to say. I've never had anyone say anything like that to me. You don't have to say anything yet. Just trust that I'm serious. I'll be by your side every step of the way. The conversation ended, but as Elon put the phone down, he felt a surge of determination wash over him. This was going to be the most important project of his life, and the one that would define him in a way no Tesla or SpaceX ever could. The challenge had begun. Days passed, and the momentum of Elon's plan only grew. It wasn't just about helping one man anymore, it had evolved into something far bigger. He wasn't sure exactly what form this journey would take, but the one thing he was certain of was that it would change the lives of countless people. Mr. Thompson was just the first domino to fall, and once that chain started, there was no telling where it would lead. Elon knew he had to approach this carefully. Mr. Thompson had spent his entire life in the background, working quietly, without fanfare or acknowledgement. The idea of suddenly thrusting him into the spotlight, giving him opportunities he hadn't dared to dream about for decades, was not only risky, it was a massive shift in mindset. Elon wasn't sure how to make it happen, but he was determined to see it through. After all, he'd built a career on taking risks, on going against the grain, and this felt like the ultimate test. Mr. Thompson, Elon said over the phone, his voice carrying the weight of a new conviction. I know this is a lot to take in. I understand if you're hesitant. But I'm here to help you find that spark again. I want to give you the tools to build something of your own, something you've always dreamed of. The hesitation on the other end was palpable. I appreciate it, Elon, I really do, Mr. Thompson replied, his voice weary, but I don't know if I'm the man for the job. It's been so long. I've spent my life cleaning up after others. I don't even know where to begin. Elon paused. He could feel the weight of Mr. Thompson's self-doubt, the years of letting go of his dreams, of putting them in a box and locking it away. It was exactly what Elon wanted to change. I'm going to make sure you have everything you need to succeed. Whether that's going back to school, getting the training you need, or just the space to remember who you really are. This is your chance. Don't let fear or time hold you back anymore. There was a long pause, and then a quiet sigh. I guess you're right. I've always put everyone else first. Maybe it's time I finally did something for me. Elon smiled. He knew that was the moment of change, the moment when Mr. Thompson, for the first time in decades, allowed himself to imagine a future where he wasn't just surviving, but thriving. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Elon's team had mobilized quickly, contacting architects, designers, and educators, all to make sure that Mr. Thompson's dream could become a reality. But the most important part of the plan was something Elon hadn't considered at first, Mr. Thompson's emotional and psychological state. The old janitor wasn't just someone who needed help with logistics or finances, he needed someone to believe in him again. Elon knew that, at his core, the janitor was a man who had suffered years of unspoken grief, of unfulfilled potential. It wasn't enough to give him the opportunity to build again, he needed the confidence to believe he could do it. He needed to remember who he was, not just as a janitor, but as a man with dreams of his own. I've been working with him, Sarah, one of Elon's trusted advisors, reported during one of their meetings. He's still apprehensive. You're right, Elon. This is bigger than just giving him the skills or resources to build. He's almost scared to start. It's like he's afraid of hoping again. Elon nodded thoughtfully. He'd dealt with failure, yes, but it had never been this deep. He had always been driven, but that drive had been fueled by ambition, by a sense of purpose that had never wavered. For Mr. Thompson, it was different. His sense of purpose had been stripped away years ago. We'll have to take it slow, Elon said, pacing in his office. Let's start small. Get him some training, give him a mentor. We need to rebuild his confidence before we can build anything else. The plan shifted from a fast-paced transformation to one of gradual growth. Elon didn't want to overwhelm Mr. Thompson, he wanted him to step into this new world at his own pace, so that when the time came, he would be ready to succeed on his own. But even with the best intentions, things didn't always go according to plan. One day, when Elon visited Mr. Thompson at the school, he could see the fear in his eyes. It wasn't just a hesitation anymore, it was a complete shutdown. I can't do it, Elon, Mr. Thompson admitted, his voice cracking. I'm too old for this. I've spent my life doing one thing, and now you want me to change everything. It's too much. Elon could feel the heaviness of those words sink into his chest. I know it's hard. But you're not too old. You've spent so much of your life giving, never taking anything for yourself. You deserve this chance. The janitor shook his head. I don't think I can ever be that man again, the one who had dreams. I've spent so long keeping them buried that I'm not even sure I know where to start. Elon stepped closer. Mr. Thompson, you've got something inside of you that most people don't have, experience. You've been through so much, and you've kept going. That's strength. You have what it takes. I believe in you. The older man looked at him, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. No one's ever said that to me before, Elon. Not like that. Not with real belief. Elon felt a surge of hope. It wasn't just about the physical journey, Mr. Thompson was about to embark on, it was the mental and emotional journey that was even more important. Elon wasn't just giving him a path to rebuild his dreams, he was giving him the permission to dream again. To believe again. To hope again. The journey wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, doubts, and fears along the way. But Elon knew that this was the only way to change Mr. Thompson's life, not just by helping him build something physical, but by helping him rebuild the foundation of hope and belief within himself. "We're going to do this together," Elon said, his voice steady. "You're not alone. We'll take it step by step." Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, then slowly nodded. "All right, Elon. Let's do it." As the conversation ended, Elon felt a shift in the air. The journey had truly begun, not just for Mr. Thompson, but for himself as well. He was no longer just a billionaire building companies or launching rockets, he was a part of something far greater. He was now an architect of dreams, a guide helping people find their way back to hope. This wasn't just about building structures or creating innovations, it was about creating a space where people could reclaim their dreams, no matter how far they had fallen or how old they were. Elon looked out the window as Mr. Thompson walked away, feeling more determined than ever. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but it was a road that would lead to something far more valuable than any invention or achievement. This journey wasn't just about success, it was about giving people the chance to be who they were meant to be. And Elon was ready to walk that path. The days after Mr. Thompson's decision to move forward with the dream were full of tension and uncertainty, but they also marked the beginning of a slow but powerful transformation. Elon knew the journey wouldn't be easy, and there were moments when it felt like everything could fall apart. But one thing became increasingly clear, Mr. Thompson had started to believe again. Elon had arranged for Mr. Thompson to meet with a mentor, an architect who had spent decades designing some of the most innovative buildings in the world. This was no small feat for someone who had spent his life cleaning floors, pushing mops, and never imagining that he could one day design something monumental. The mentor, a woman named Sarah Matthews, was a genius, a visionary in her own right. She was compassionate but tough, and she knew exactly how to push Mr. Thompson without overwhelming him. Her presence was essential for his growth. At first, Mr. Thompson was overwhelmed by Sarah's passion. When he first met her in a modest office at a local architecture firm, he could barely speak. The idea of being in such a creative environment, surrounded by blueprints, models, and designers, was enough to make his heart race. "I'm just an old janitor," he muttered as he looked at the room filled with futuristic designs and towering glass skyscrapers. "I don't belong here." Sarah smiled kindly but firmly. "You belong here more than anyone else, Mr. Thompson. You've spent your life building something important, just not in the way you think. Now, we're going to build something new." But that first meeting didn't go smoothly. The more Sarah pushed Mr. Thompson to think creatively, the more resistance he gave. It was like he couldn't let go of the image he had built for himself over the years, the quiet, invisible man cleaning up after others. The idea of creating something out of nothing seemed almost alien to him. After the meeting, Elon called him to check in. Mr. Thompson's voice was shaky when he answered. "I can't do this, Elon. I'm too old. I'm too broken. Sarah is great, but I can't see myself as part of this world. The world of architects and designers, it's not mine. I've always been the one cleaning the mess. I don't know how to build." Elon paused. He could feel the weight of Mr. Thompson's words, but he refused to let it shake his resolve. This wasn't just about teaching a man how to design buildings, it was about giving him a second chance, a chance to rebuild his very identity. "Mr. Thompson, you've spent decades building other people's dreams. Now it's time for you to build your own," Elon said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "You may feel like you're too old, but I promise you, the world doesn't care about age. It only cares about passion, about purpose. And you've got that in spades." There was a long silence on the other end, and then, quietly, Mr. Thompson spoke. You really think so? I know so, Elon said firmly. You've got a lifetime of experience that no one else can match. And you've lived through things that could have crushed most people. That's your strength, Mr. Thompson. Let it guide you. The conversation was a turning point, but it wasn't the final one. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when Mr. Thompson had started working on his first design with Sarah, that the emotional climax of his journey came into full view. The design was simple at first, a small community center, a place for people who had been overlooked, just like he had been. But as he poured himself into the work, something unexpected happened. Mr. Thompson found his rhythm. The ideas began to flow. He wasn't just designing a building, he was designing a legacy, something that would outlive him. And with every line he drew, he began to see a new version of himself emerging. But just when it seemed like he had finally found his place, the past came crashing down. One afternoon, Mr. Thompson had an emotional breakdown in front of Elon and Sarah. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can finish this, he said, his voice trembling as tears welled up in his eyes. I've spent so many years telling myself that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't deserve anything more. I've failed so many times before. What if this is just another mistake? Elon and Sarah were silent, unsure of how to respond. It was a raw, vulnerable moment, one that cracked open all the walls Mr. Thompson had built around himself over the years. For the first time, he was confronting the depth of his own self-doubt. You're not a failure, Mr. Thompson, Elon said quietly. You're a survivor. And you've learned more from the life you've lived than any book or class could teach you. This isn't just about architecture. This is about your heart. This is about letting go of the fear that's held you back all these years. Sarah nodded in agreement. What you're doing here isn't easy. But it's worth it. You've got the talent, and more importantly, you've got the passion. That's what will carry you through. The words settled in the room like a heavy mist. It was a long, hard road, but something had clicked inside of Mr. Thompson. He wasn't just afraid of failure, he was afraid of succeeding. Of proving to himself that he was more than just the janitor. I've been holding on to this idea that I'm not good enough, Mr. Thompson admitted, his voice shaking. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I do have something to offer. Elon could feel the tension in the air begin to lift, like a storm cloud that had finally broken. It was as though Mr. Thompson had finally found a piece of himself he'd long buried. The path was no longer just a dream, it was real. He wasn't just building a community center. He was rebuilding his life. And with that realization came something even more powerful. Mr. Thompson was ready to embrace the world again. He was ready to leave behind the self-doubt that had plagued him for so long. He was ready to succeed. But just as the breakthrough seemed to arrive, another challenge arose, one that would test both Elon and Mr. Thompson in ways they hadn't anticipated. The design for the community center was accepted, but the funding for the project fell through. There was no way to proceed with the project without the necessary financial backing, and it felt like everything they had worked for might collapse. The emotional climax of Mr. Thompson's journey wasn't just about overcoming self-doubt, it was about learning to face the external obstacles that had always been part of his life. And now, the real test would begin. Mr. Thompson, Elon said, as they faced the setback together, we're not giving up. We'll find another way. This wasn't the end of the road. It was just another challenge, one that would require perseverance, belief, and creativity. And no matter what happened next, Elon knew one thing for certain, Mr. Thompson's journey had only just begun. The days following the funding setback were some of the most difficult of Elon's entire journey. He had seen it in Mr. Thompson's eyes, the doubt, the fear, the crushing weight of having to face yet another hurdle after everything they had already been through. It wasn't just the community center that was at risk anymore. It was the very sense of hope they had worked so hard to build. For Mr. Thompson, the setback felt like a final, cruel reminder of his past, a past full of broken promises and dashed dreams. The thought of trying again, of reaching out and asking for help, seemed impossible. It felt like an insurmountable mountain, one that would never allow him to get to the top. Elon understood. He had been there before, countless times, in fact. He knew that the path to success was rarely linear, and it was always paved with obstacles, some of them large and insidious. But he also knew that the greatest lessons came not from the easy victories but from the failures and the perseverance required to push through them. "Mr. Thompson," Elon said one morning, after several days of silent contemplation. "We've been through a lot already, haven't we?" Mr. Thompson, sitting in his modest apartment, nodded, his hands resting on his knees. "I thought I was ready. I thought this was the chance I'd been waiting for all my life. But now I don't know if I have it in me anymore." Elon leaned forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. "What you've been through is a testament to your strength. You've faced more than most people, and yet, you're still standing. That says something. But what if it's not enough? What if this, what we're trying to do, just isn't meant to be?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elon paused. He'd heard those words from countless entrepreneurs, dreamers, and visionaries. It was the sound of giving up, of letting the weight of failure dictate the future. But Elon wasn't ready to let Mr. Thompson fall into that trap. Not now, not after everything they had done together. "You know, Mr. Thompson," Elon said, his voice calm yet firm, "when I first started out, I had nothing but ideas, and they seemed impossible. People laughed at me, told me I was dreaming too big. But the difference between those who succeed and those who don't is simple, it's the willingness to keep going, even when you don't have all the answers, even when the odds are against you. The truth is, we're not just doing this for the community center. We're doing this because it's a symbol of something bigger, a symbol of you." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning. Mr. Thompson looked at Elon, his brow furrowed, unsure of what to say next. But something in Elon's words began to shift something inside him. It wasn't just about the building, it was about reclaiming the very essence of who he was, about showing the world that he still had something to give. "You don't need to have all the answers today," Elon continued, his voice growing softer. "You don't need to know how it's going to work out, but you can't stop trying. I'm here, Sarah's here, and we'll find a way. Because that's what we do, we find a way, no matter what." Mr. Thompson sat in silence for a moment, processing Elon's words. Slowly, a small but significant shift occurred. His shoulders, which had been heavy with the weight of failure, seemed to ease slightly. His hands, which had once trembled at the thought of creating something new, began to steady. "I don't know if I can do it on my own," Mr. Thompson finally said, his voice still tentative. "But I'm willing to try again. With your help." Elon smiled, feeling a surge of relief and pride. "That's all I need to hear. And that's all anyone needs to hear. It's not about doing it alone, it's about doing it together. We're a team. And a team never gives up." In the weeks that followed, things began to change. Elon and Mr. Thompson, alongside Sarah and a handful of other volunteers, began reaching out to new investors, exploring alternative ways to fund the community center. Elon called in favors, made deals, and pushed his network of contacts to rally behind this project. It wasn't easy. Some doors remained closed. Others opened just a crack, enough to squeeze through. But the breakthrough came when a group of philanthropists, inspired by Mr. Thompson's journey, offered a substantial donation to get the project off the ground. The gesture wasn't just about money, it was about belief. They saw in Mr. Thompson's story the same thing Elon had seen, the power of perseverance, the strength of a person who refused to give up, no matter how many times life knocked them down. As the funding came together, construction on the community center began. It wasn't an extravagant building, but it didn't need to be. It was a place for people who had been forgotten, a place where dreams could be rebuilt, where people could gather and connect. It became a symbol of everything that Elon, Mr. Thompson, and everyone involved had fought for: second chances, resilience, and the power of community. When the day of the grand opening arrived, Elon stood beside Mr. Thompson, watching as people poured into the newly constructed space. It was a humbling sight, a testament to the hard work, the dedication, and the belief that had made it all possible. The community center wasn't just a physical space, it was a reflection of the transformation that had taken place in Mr. Thompson's life. "I never thought I'd see this day," Mr. Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd have the chance to build something like this." "You did," Elon replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We all did. You built this, Mr. Thompson. You're the one who made it happen." Tears welled in Mr. Thompson's eyes as he looked around at the bustling community. It was a far cry from the man who had once cleaned the floors of a high school, unsure of where his life was going. Now, he stood tall, a man who had reclaimed his dreams and built something that would last far longer than any of his past struggles. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Mr. Thompson asked quietly, his voice filled with wonder. As they stood there together, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the community center, Elon realized that this was more than just a story of a man rediscovering his potential. It was a reminder to all of them that no matter how old, how lost, or how broken they might feel at times, it was never too late to start over. The future was theirs to build. And that was the real lesson, the one that would stay with them all for the rest of their lives. The grand opening of the community center marked a new beginning for Mr. Thompson, but it also opened the door to even more possibilities. As the excitement of the first few weeks wore off, the real work began. The community center was thriving, but it wasn't just about the building anymore. It was about what happened inside it, the people it would help, the lives it would touch, and the new paths it would open for everyone involved. For Mr. Thompson, the community center wasn't just his achievement, it was his responsibility. He had spent so many years cleaning up after others, making sure everything ran smoothly without ever being noticed. Now, he was in the spotlight, and with it came pressure. The fear of failure was no longer an abstract concept, it was a constant, gnawing presence at the back of his mind. What if he let everyone down? What if he couldn't live up to the expectations that had been set for him? Elon saw the doubt creeping back into Mr. Thompson's eyes, just as it had in the beginning of their journey. But this time, it wasn't about reinventing himself, it was about taking what he had built and pushing it to the next level. There was no going back. The question now was how to scale it, how to make the community center a permanent fixture in the lives of the people who needed it most. "I don't know if I can keep up with all of this, Mr. Thompson admitted one evening, after a long day of meetings with local businesses, community leaders, and volunteers. The center had taken off quickly, and with the new attention, there were more people to answer to, more decisions to be made. Elon sat across from him in the small, cozy office that had become Mr. Thompson's new command center. "You're doing great. The community center is exactly what people need, and it's starting to show. But I can tell you're overwhelmed. You can't do this alone, you know." "I don't want to ask for too much," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice low. "I've already asked so many people for help, and now this is all on me. What if I fail? What if I can't keep up with everything?" "You won't fail," Elon said, his voice unwavering. "But you need a team. You can't carry this on your own, and that's okay. You don't have to do it all." Mr. Thompson hesitated. For so long, he had been the one in the background, the one who cleaned up after others. He had spent years as the invisible man. Asking for help felt like he was betraying everything he had believed in. "But I don't know how to lead a team," he confessed. "I don't know how to manage all of this." Elon leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've already led in ways you don't even realize. You've led by example, by showing up when it was tough, by being there for others when they needed you. You've already proven yourself. Now, you just need to learn how to guide others the same way. The words hit Mr. Thompson like a ton of bricks. He had always thought leadership was something grand, something that required grand gestures or big speeches. But maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it wasn't about being the loudest or the most charismatic. Maybe it was about consistency, reliability, and the willingness to be vulnerable and ask for help when it was needed. The next morning, Mr. Thompson called a meeting with the key staff members of the community center. Elon had encouraged him to do this for weeks, but it had taken some time for Mr. Thompson to come to terms with it. He had never seen himself as a leader, and the idea of taking charge in such an important way filled him with anxiety. But he knew it was time. As he stood before the small group of volunteers, local business owners, and community members who had supported the center's rise, Mr. Thompson felt a wave of nerves wash over him. But as he looked out at the faces in front of him, he saw something that made him pause, a group of people who believed in the center, in the vision, and in him. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "I know I haven't always been the most confident person. I've spent so much of my life in the background, cleaning up after others, doing the work that no one else wanted to do. But this center. This is something special. And it's something that we can all be proud of. It's not just my dream anymore, it's all of ours." He took a deep breath and continued. "I've learned a lot these past few months. And what I've learned is that we can't do this alone. I need all of you to help me lead this community center. We need to be a team, and we need to trust each other." The words felt strange coming from his mouth, but they also felt right. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need to. He had a team that had already proven it could make a difference, and that was enough. "I'm not perfect," he added, smiling nervously. "But I'm willing to learn, and I know we can make this work." The room was silent for a moment, and then one of the volunteers, a woman named Anna, spoke up. "You're doing great, Mr. Thompson. We all believe in you. You've already given us something to believe in. We're with you." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than Mr. Thompson could have imagined. That was all he needed to hear. In that moment, he realized that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, it was about creating an environment where others felt empowered to step up, share their ideas, and contribute to the mission. As the weeks turned into months, the community center continued to grow. Mr. Thompson learned how to delegate, how to trust his team, and how to lean on others when things got tough. The fear of failure was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. Instead, it became a reminder to keep pushing forward, no matter what. The center began offering more programs, workshops, educational courses, and mentorship for young people who, like Mr. Thompson once had, felt like they didn't have a place in the world. The center became a hub for growth and opportunity, not just for the people it served, but for everyone involved. Elon watched from the sidelines, proud of how far Mr. Thompson had come. The man who had once felt invisible was now a pillar of his community, someone who was creating change on a scale he had never dreamed possible. But even as the center flourished, Elon knew that the true journey for Mr. Thompson was only just beginning. There were still more challenges ahead. The community center was a success, but it had also exposed a much larger need. What if they could expand? What if they could do this on a larger scale, reaching even more communities in need? Mr. Thompson didn't have the answer yet. But one thing was clear, he was no longer afraid to try. The possibilities were endless, and for the first time in his life, Mr. Thompson believed he could achieve whatever he set his mind to. As he stood in the center one evening, looking out over the bustling activity, people working, learning, laughing, he couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning. The future was wide open. The day after the community center celebrated its first major milestone, Elon sat with Mr. Thompson in the small office, looking over the plans for the next phase. They had made it through some of the toughest hurdles already, but there was a palpable sense that something bigger was on the horizon. The community center was growing rapidly, but they both knew it could reach even greater heights, if they played their cards right. "I've been thinking about something," Elon said, tapping his finger against the table as he leaned forward. "The way this place is taking off, it's clear that you've built something special here, Mr. Thompson. But what if we took this to the next level?" Mr. Thompson looked up from the pile of paperwork on the desk, unsure of where this was heading. "Next level?" he echoed, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You're already making a difference here," Elon said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "You've tapped into a real need in the community. People need this space, and they're responding to it in ways that are way beyond expectations. But what if we could expand? Not just in this town, but into other communities that need the same thing, places where people feel like they don't have a home, a place to turn to." Mr. Thompson sat back, his mind racing. The idea was intriguing, but it also seemed daunting. He had never imagined anything beyond what he had already accomplished. The community center had been a dream, but to expand it, what did that even look like? "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," Mr. Thompson admitted quietly. "I can barely keep up with this place, and now you're talking about spreading it all over?" Elon leaned back in his chair and gave him a knowing smile. "That's the thing. You don't have to do it alone. You've got a team now, and we can build on that. I'm not asking you to do it all yourself. I'm talking about building a network, partnerships, investment, and using what you've learned here to bring this model to other communities." The thought was overwhelming, but it also stirred something in Mr. Thompson. He had spent years feeling like he wasn't capable of creating something big, but now, for the first time, he was faced with the possibility of doing just that. "Okay, I get it," Mr. Thompson said slowly. "But how would we even begin? What's the first step?" Elon leaned in, his voice filled with conviction. "First, we look at what's working here. We've got a successful model, a community-driven space that provides education, mentorship, and a sense of belonging. We replicate that model, but we need to get more people involved. I'll help with the funding, and you focus on building out the network of people who believe in this. If we can prove that this works in other communities, we'll have the chance to create something much bigger." Mr. Thompson took a deep breath. This wasn't just about a building anymore. This was about changing lives on a much broader scale. He had always been a man of small, consistent actions, making sure the floors were clean, making sure the little things were taken care of. But now, the task ahead seemed to require something far larger. It was no longer just about taking care of a building, it was about taking care of a movement, a vision for something more significant than he could have ever imagined. "We could start by reaching out to some of the other local leaders, right?" Mr. Thompson asked, starting to feel the weight of the challenge but also the excitement of what lay ahead. "Exactly," Elon replied. "Build relationships, get local communities involved, and see if there's a way to extend the impact. If we can prove that the model works here, we can make it work everywhere." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, late nights, and difficult decisions. They reached out to various local leaders, community organizers, and philanthropists to gauge interest in expanding the community center model. Some were skeptical, but many were intrigued. The idea of creating spaces that provided not only basic resources but also a sense of belonging struck a chord with a lot of people. But there were still obstacles. They had to figure out how to replicate the community center in different cities, how to ensure that each new location would be just as successful as the first. It wasn't as simple as building a building, it was about building a culture, a mindset, a network of support. The challenges were immense, but so were the possibilities. As the concept began to gain traction, Mr. Thompson found himself in a place he had never expected to be, on the verge of creating something much larger than himself. The community center he had once built as a way to give back to his community was now poised to become a model for other cities, for other people who felt just like he once had, a little lost, a little forgotten, but still determined to build a better life. He often found himself lying awake at night, thinking about the enormity of what they were trying to do. What if it didn't work? What if they failed? But then, he remembered what Elon had said to him, what he had learned over the past few months. They didn't need to have all the answers right away. They just needed to take the first step and trust the process. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Mr. Thompson said to Elon one evening as they walked through the community center after hours. "This is real. This could be bigger than anything I ever imagined." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's going to be big, Mr. Thompson. But the most important part is that it's going to be meaningful. And when people are inspired to act, they don't just build something physical, they build something that lasts. This won't just be a community center. It'll be a place where people find hope, where they realize that they can change their lives, too." Mr. Thompson stood silently, his eyes taking in the now quiet space that had once been just a dream. The center had already changed so many lives, and now, they were going to give that opportunity to even more people. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. This was the moment to step forward, to take what they had and use it to create something even bigger. "I'm ready," Mr. Thompson said quietly, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. "Let's do it." And so, with that simple declaration, they set their sights on a new horizon. What started as a community center in a small town was about to become a beacon of hope for people everywhere. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be many more hurdles to overcome, but for the first time, Mr. Thompson felt that he had the strength to face whatever came next. This was just the beginning. The real challenge was ahead. With the momentum of their success at the community center, Mr. Thompson and Elon Musk now found themselves at the precipice of something much larger than either had ever anticipated. They had already proven that the model worked in their town. Now, it was time to test it in other communities, in different cities, and perhaps even across the country. As they started reaching out to potential partners in other areas, Mr. Thompson couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. He had spent so many years working behind the scenes, silently making sure everything was in order. And now, he was expected to lead a movement, a vision that could change the way communities were built and supported. The first big step was to identify which cities were ready for this type of center. Mr. Thompson and Elon met with local leaders, business owners, and philanthropists across the state. Some cities were eager, while others were hesitant. There were concerns about the sustainability of such a model. Would the community really show up? Would people commit to making it work? At the same time, Elon worked on securing the necessary funding. As expected, investors were intrigued by the project, but they wanted to see a solid plan, one that wasn't just based on goodwill, but on measurable outcomes. They wanted to see how the community center could scale effectively, how it could continue to generate positive change without relying too heavily on outside support. Elon knew it wouldn't be easy. He had faced similar challenges when launching his own ventures. But he also knew that Mr. Thompson's vision was genuine. The community center wasn't a profit-driven enterprise, it was built on a foundation of care, connection, and purpose. That authenticity was what would make it succeed. It was a week before they would officially start opening the first new community center in a different city, and Mr. Thompson was feeling the pressure. He couldn't help but reflect on the days when his life had been much simpler. Back then, his biggest worry had been making sure the floors were spotless. Now, he was a leader, with expectations placed squarely on his shoulders. The imposter syndrome that had once been a quiet whisper in his mind was now louder than ever. Could he really do this on a larger scale? What if he failed? One evening, after a long day of meetings and strategizing, Mr. Thompson found himself alone at the original community center. The building was quiet, the hum of activity replaced by stillness. He walked through the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing off the walls. It was hard to believe how far they had come, and yet, there was still so much more to do. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him. "You okay?" It was Elon, who had come to check on him. The concern in his voice was unmistakable, and Mr. Thompson knew his friend could sense his unease. "I'm just worried," Mr. Thompson admitted. "What if I can't do this? What if it's all too much? I've never been a leader before, and now we're talking about expanding this whole thing to other cities. What if it falls apart?" Elon stepped closer, his expression softening. "I get it. This is huge. But listen to me, what you've built here isn't about one person. It's about the people who've come together to support it. You've created something real, something that matters. People want this. They need it." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "But it's one thing to succeed in a small town. It's another thing entirely to scale this up. I'm scared, Elon." Elon placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Fear is natural. It's what keeps us grounded. But it's also what drives us to do more. What you're doing isn't easy, but it's worth it. You've got the passion, the vision, and the heart to lead this. And, most importantly, you've got a team behind you. You're not alone in this." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. Elon's words were always the kind that seemed to cut straight through the fog of doubt. The truth was, he didn't want to let anyone down, not the people who had already been helped by the community center, not the new cities they were about to reach, and certainly not himself. He had spent so long in the background that the thought of being in the spotlight was terrifying, but maybe it was time to step into it, fully and without reservation. The next morning, with renewed determination, Mr. Thompson got to work. He focused on the logistics of opening the new centers. The first step was securing the right location in the new city. The center had to be in a place that was accessible, visible, and ideally near areas of need. It wasn't enough to just build a building, it had to be built in a way that would integrate into the fabric of the community. They found the perfect spot in a neighborhood that had been struggling. It was a place where many families lived, but there weren't enough resources to go around. The center would be a place of hope, a place for families to connect, to learn, and to thrive. One evening, after a long day of meetings and strategizing, Mr. Thompson found himself alone at the original community center. The building was quiet, the hum of activity replaced by stillness. He walked through the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing off the walls. It was hard to believe how far they had come, and yet, there was still so much more to do. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him. "You okay?" It was Elon, who had come to check on him. The concern in his voice was unmistakable, and Mr. Thompson knew his friend could sense his unease. "I'm just worried," Mr. Thompson admitted. "What if I can't do this? What if it's all too much? I've never been a leader before, and now we're talking about expanding this whole thing to other cities. What if it falls apart?" Elon stepped closer, his expression softening. "I get it. This is huge. But listen to me, what you've built here isn't about one person. It's about the people who've come together to support it. You've created something real, something that matters. People want this. They need it." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "But it's one thing to succeed in a small town. It's another thing entirely to scale this up. I'm scared, Elon." Elon placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Fear is natural. It's what keeps us grounded. But it's also what drives us to do more. What you're doing isn't easy, but it's worth it. You've got the passion, the vision, and the heart to lead this. And, most importantly, you've got a team behind you. You're not alone in this." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. Elon's words were always the kind that seemed to cut straight through the fog of doubt. The truth was, he didn't want to let anyone down, not the people who had already been helped by the community center, not the new cities they were about to reach, and certainly not himself. He had spent so long in the background that the thought of being in the spotlight was terrifying, but maybe it was time to step into it, fully and without reservation. The next morning, with renewed determination, Mr. Thompson got to work. He focused on the logistics of opening the new centers. The first step was securing the right location in the new city. The center had to be in a place that was accessible, visible, and ideally near areas of need. It wasn't enough to just build a building, it had to be built in a way that would integrate into the fabric of the community. They found the perfect spot in a neighborhood that had been struggling. It was a place where many families lived, but there weren't enough resources to go around. The center would be a place of hope, a place for families to connect, to learn, and to thrive. But even as things were moving forward, Mr. Thompson couldn't shake his fears. Would the new center attract the right people? Would they stay? The truth was, there were no guarantees. The success of the original center had been organic, it had grown because people had found it and wanted it. Now, they were going to have to work even harder to make sure the new locations had the same impact. As the weeks went by, the construction of the new center was completed. It was an emotional moment for Mr. Thompson, who couldn't help but remember the first time he'd walked into the original building, the time when it was just an idea. This new space represented more than just a building. It was a chance to replicate the success, a chance to reach more people, and a chance to change lives on a much larger scale. On the day of the grand opening, the ribbon-cutting ceremony was filled with excitement. The local leaders, businesses, and volunteers all gathered to celebrate the opening of the first new community center. Mr. Thompson stood at the front, flanked by Elon and a few key community members. The doors were open, and the first families were already walking in, looking around with awe. As the ceremony continued, Mr. Thompson couldn't help but think back to the moment when he had first started working as a janitor. He had never imagined that this day would come, that he would be standing in front of so many people as a leader. The community was proud of him, and he was proud of himself. "I did it," he whispered to himself, barely believing the words. "You did," Elon said with a grin. "And this is only the beginning." Mr. Thompson smiled, finally feeling like he had earned the right to stand in the spotlight. He had built something that mattered, something that could impact lives for generations to come. And the journey was far from over. As the new community center opened its doors and began welcoming families, the excitement and optimism that had surrounded its launch started to give way to the reality of running such a large-scale operation. While the community embraced the center, Mr. Thompson and Elon both knew that the real test was just beginning. In the first few weeks, there was an overwhelming wave of support. Families flocked to the center, eager for the resources it promised, and volunteers lined up to help. It seemed like everything was running smoothly. However, behind the scenes, Mr. Thompson and his team began to encounter a series of unexpected challenges. One of the first hurdles they faced was staffing. The community center model relied heavily on passionate individuals who believed in its mission, but the larger they grew, the more difficult it was to maintain that tight-knit, family-like atmosphere. The number of volunteers was high, but keeping everyone motivated and aligned with the original vision was proving to be a challenge. Mr. Thompson sat in his office one afternoon, looking over the growing list of to-dos. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. His mind was filled with questions. How could they keep the heart of the center intact as they expanded? How could they ensure that the same sense of community they'd built in the original center would remain as they opened more locations? "I don't know if I'm cut out for this," Mr. Thompson muttered to himself. "I don't want to lose what we have here." At that moment, Elon walked in, a cup of coffee in hand. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mr. Thompson chuckled weakly. "I'm just worried. Everything's growing so fast, and I feel like I'm losing control of the heart of the center. We started this thing with so much passion, and now I don't want it to become just another corporate model." Elon nodded, setting the coffee down on the table. "I get it. It's tough. The bigger we get, the more we need to systematize things. But I promise you, the spirit of the community center doesn't have to be lost. We just need to make sure we're keeping the right people in the right positions, people who are passionate and understand the mission." Mr. Thompson looked at Elon, the weight of his concern still on his shoulders. But how do we find those people? And how do we keep them engaged as we grow? Elon leaned forward. You've already got the formula, you've built something that people want. The key is empowering others to lead. People need ownership. They need to feel like they're making a difference, just like you did when you first started here. We can teach them to run things, but the heart of it stays with the people who truly care. It was exactly what Mr. Thompson needed to hear. He had always been a behind-the-scenes kind of guy, but now he was thrust into a leadership role that required him to step back and allow others to take charge. It was a shift he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but he knew it was essential for the longevity of the movement. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Thompson began focusing on creating a leadership program within the center. He and Elon worked together to develop training sessions for key staff and volunteers, people who would take ownership of different aspects of the operation, from organizing events to managing volunteers. The goal was to ensure that each center maintained its core mission, even as it expanded and grew in complexity. But staffing wasn't the only issue they had to tackle. The sheer logistics of running multiple centers at once soon became overwhelming. Every new location came with its own set of challenges, everything from navigating local bureaucracy to ensuring that each center had enough funding to stay afloat. One afternoon, as Mr. Thompson sat in a meeting with a team of financial planners, he found himself facing yet another obstacle. They had been working hard to secure sustainable funding for the new community centers, but the costs were rapidly outpacing their expectations. The expenses for everything, from utilities to educational programs, were far higher than they had initially projected. Mr. Thompson could feel the pressure mounting as they discussed their financial projections. We're going to need to bring in more donors, or we'll risk running into financial trouble within the next 6 months, the financial advisor said, looking grim. We've expanded quickly, but we didn't fully anticipate the operational costs. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, his mind racing. It was always the fear he had harbored in the back of his mind: could they maintain this growth? Could they really sustain this vision on a large scale? Elon had always been a visionary, but even he couldn't ignore the harsh reality of the situation. We're going to need to find innovative ways to bring in additional revenue, Elon said, his voice filled with determination. This can't just be about donations. We need to look at other funding models. Maybe partnerships with local businesses, corporate sponsorships, or even leveraging technology. Mr. Thompson felt the weight of the decisions ahead of him. They couldn't afford to wait. The future of the community center was at stake. As the days passed, Mr. Thompson and Elon found themselves brainstorming new ideas to generate revenue. They reached out to local businesses to propose partnerships that would benefit both the companies and the center. The idea was simple: by supporting the community center, businesses could enhance their public image while making a tangible impact on the community. Meanwhile, Elon's team began working on creating a digital platform that would allow the community center to offer online workshops and resources. The idea was to expand their reach, not just to local communities but to individuals who didn't have access to the physical space. This could become another revenue stream while providing more resources to people in need. Still, no matter how hard they worked, the challenges felt insurmountable at times. Every day brought new problems, new obstacles to overcome, and sometimes, it seemed like they were fighting an uphill battle. It was easy to get lost in the details and forget the original mission. But every time Mr. Thompson felt the weight of these roadblocks, he would look back at the faces of the people who had benefited from the community center, the single mothers, the kids with no place to go, the elderly individuals who had found a sense of belonging. That was what kept him going. The roadblocks were just that, roadblocks. They were obstacles, but they weren't the end of the journey. There was still more to be done, and if he had learned anything so far, it was that every challenge was an opportunity to do something bigger. The dream they were building wasn't just about overcoming the odds. It was about giving people the tools they needed to rise above their circumstances, just as he had once done. "We'll figure this out," Mr. Thompson said to Elon one evening, after a particularly frustrating meeting with a potential donor. I don't know how, but we will. Elon smiled, his confidence unwavering. That's the spirit. We've come this far because we've been willing to face the tough stuff head-on. We just need to keep pushing forward. And so, despite the setbacks, despite the fears, Mr. Thompson knew one thing for sure: they weren't giving up. Not now, not ever. The road ahead might be long and filled with obstacles, but with each new challenge, they were building something that mattered, a legacy of hope, support, and change. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It had been a few months since the grand opening of the new community centers, and although things had settled into a routine, there were still moments of anxiety and doubt. The centers had been well received, but there were still a lot of unknowns. Mr. Thompson had learned that the work of scaling a dream was never as smooth as it seemed, and there were always more questions than answers. One crisp afternoon, Mr. Thompson was in his office reviewing budget reports when an unexpected visitor arrived. A young man, probably in his early 30s, stood in the doorway. His sharp suit and confident demeanor contrasted sharply with the humble setting of the community center. "Mr. Thompson," the man said with a firm handshake, his voice steady and authoritative. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" Mr. Thompson replied, adjusting his glasses and standing up, a bit puzzled by the unexpected interruption. "My name is Ryan Daniels. I work with a few investors who are interested in what you're doing here. We've been keeping an eye on your progress." Mr. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. Investors. It was a word he had heard many times in meetings with Elon, but hearing it directed at his own work felt strange. He had always viewed the community center as a place of refuge, not a business venture. What kind of interest are we talking about?" Mr. Thompson asked cautiously, not sure if he was ready for what this meeting might entail. Ryan smiled, clearly understanding the skepticism in Mr. Thompson's voice. "We're interested in helping you expand even further. We've been watching how quickly you've been able to establish these centers and how well they're working. There's a lot of potential here, and we think we could help you accelerate that growth." Mr. Thompson felt a rush of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the idea of getting more financial backing was incredibly appealing. It could solve a lot of the problems they had been facing, the staffing issues, the funding struggles, and the pressure to maintain the center's momentum. On the other hand, there was something about bringing in investors that felt off. "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure we want to lose the heart of what this center is about," Mr. Thompson said. "This isn't a business in the traditional sense. It's about people, and if we start answering to investors, we might lose that." Ryan nodded. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Thompson. That's why we're not just talking about giving you money. We're talking about a partnership. We want to help scale the operation, but we respect what you've built. The goal here is to give you the resources you need without compromising your values." Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, digesting Ryan's words. It was clear this was a well-thought-out proposal, and Ryan's approach seemed different from the usual corporate pitch. But was it too good to be true? Just then, Elon walked into the room, his usual casual attire and enthusiastic energy filling the space. He had been out meeting with community leaders, working on the next expansion, but he had come back early after hearing about the potential investor. "Ryan. I see you've met Mr. Thompson," Elon said, extending a hand. "I heard you've got an interesting offer on the table." Ryan smiled, his posture relaxing a little now that Elon had entered the room. "Yes, Mr. Musk. We believe there's a real opportunity here to grow the model you and Mr. Thompson have created, and we'd like to help make that happen." Elon glanced at Mr. Thompson, who was still processing everything Ryan had said. He could see the doubt in his friend's eyes. Elon had been the one pushing for expansion, always looking for ways to make things bigger, but he also understood the deep connection Mr. Thompson had to the original community center. "I think we're listening, Ryan." What do you have in mind? Elon asked, his voice calm but curious. Ryan's eyes lit up, sensing the opening. Well, we're thinking of a combination of financial backing and strategic advice. My team has worked with other socially minded projects, and we believe there's a way to scale up your centers without losing the core mission. We can help with marketing, fundraising, and building a sustainable financial model. And with the right investment, we could have 5 more centers up and running by the end of the year. Elon raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. That's ambitious. But it sounds like you've got the resources to back it up. Ryan nodded. Absolutely. We're not here to take over. We're here to empower you to do more of what you're already doing so well. With the right support, you'll be able to focus on what matters most, building those relationships, strengthening the community, and reaching even more people who need it. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He knew that growing the community center had to come with a certain amount of sacrifice, but was he ready to bring in outside influence? Was he ready to let go of some of the control he had worked so hard to maintain? We're not in this just for profit, Mr. Thompson said, his voice firm but thoughtful. This has to be about people. It always has been. Ryan smiled again. I understand completely. That's why we're offering this partnership. We want to be part of something meaningful, something that's going to make a real difference. Elon turned to Mr. Thompson, sensing the hesitation but also seeing the potential. Maybe it's worth considering. We could have a meeting with their team, see the specifics of their plan, and make sure it aligns with everything we've built here. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, still unsure. But the truth was, he trusted Elon. Elon had always been able to see the bigger picture, and maybe, just maybe, this was the way to help the community centers grow in a sustainable way. I'll think about it, Mr. Thompson said. But no promises. Ryan stood up, extending his hand once more. Of course. Take your time. We're here when you're ready. As Ryan left the office, Mr. Thompson and Elon were left in the quiet of the room, the decision still looming. I think we should give them a chance, Elon said after a long pause. They seem genuine, and we can't do this alone forever. The right partnership could help us scale without losing our soul. Mr. Thompson still had doubts, but he knew that the community center's success couldn't be a solo endeavor forever. If they wanted to truly make a difference, they needed to evolve, carefully, and with the right people by their side. And as the door closed behind Ryan, Mr. Thompson knew one thing for sure: whatever happened next, the journey was only just beginning. The decision to meet with Ryan's team had been a tough one for Mr. Thompson. He knew that expanding the community center project would mean bringing in more resources, but the idea of involving investors still felt like walking a tightrope. He didn't want to lose the essence of what they had built. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that doing nothing wasn't an option either. As he sat down with Elon to discuss the next steps, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. The center had already made such a profound impact on the local community, and this partnership had the potential to reach even more people. But could they preserve their values and still succeed in a business world driven by profits? You know, I've been thinking a lot about what Ryan said, Mr. Thompson confessed, leaning back in his chair. He seems sincere, but I still can't shake the feeling that we're walking into something bigger than we expected. This could change everything, Elon. Elon smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. Change isn't always bad. Sometimes it's the only way to go forward. Look, I get it. I really do. This is a huge step. But we're not just taking their money. We're bringing in expertise. We're not selling out. We're just making sure we have the tools to do even more good. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, taking in Elon's words. As much as he feared losing control, he had to admit that Elon was right. The community center was already growing at an extraordinary rate, and without the right infrastructure, it could all fall apart. That evening, they set up a meeting with Ryan and his team. They gathered in one of the larger conference rooms at the main center. The team from Ryan's investment firm was professional and well-dressed, their energy full of determination. Mr. Thompson, Elon, and their core team were present, sitting across the table, ready to hear out the proposal in detail. Ryan stood up first, his manner confident, but respectful. "Thank you for meeting with us," he began, scanning the room. "We're all very impressed with what you've built so far, and we see a huge potential for growth. Our goal isn't just to help you scale, it's to make sure the essence of what you're doing here remains intact." The team behind Ryan had prepared a comprehensive presentation, outlining exactly what their involvement would look like. There were detailed plans for marketing, staffing, and the necessary capital for expanding more centers. They talked about long-term sustainability, ways to attract corporate sponsors, and even how they would help refine the online platforms that were just beginning to take shape. As the meeting went on, Mr. Thompson began to see the vision in a new light. They weren't asking him to hand over control, they were offering guidance, mentorship, and resources that would allow the community centers to expand while staying true to their mission. They were offering not just money, but expertise that could help them avoid the mistakes of rapid growth. Elon listened intently, always the strategic thinker. "I like what I'm hearing," he said, turning to Mr. Thompson. "This could help us create a model that's even more sustainable, and more importantly, it could help us spread this vision to other cities." Mr. Thompson took a deep breath. He had been worried about losing the personal touch that had made the center so special, but now he was starting to see a way forward that could honor their original mission. They weren't compromising, they were evolving. The center could be bigger, but still rooted in the values of service, community, and connection. "I'm on board," Mr. Thompson said, his voice steady. "But I need one thing from you all. I want to make sure that every decision we make is in the best interest of the people we serve. I don't want the heart of this place to get lost in all the expansion." Ryan nodded, understanding the gravity of Mr. Thompson's request. "Of course. We wouldn't want it any other way. That's the foundation of everything we're doing here, making sure we help people first, and profit second." The room was quiet for a moment as the weight of the decision settled in. It was a monumental shift, but it felt right. With the right guidance and resources, they could bring the vision of the community center to even more people, people who needed it the most. The days following the meeting with Ryan's team were filled with a flurry of activity. The partnership was officially underway, and Mr. Thompson found himself more involved in the operational side of things than ever before. His role was shifting, and while it was challenging, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Ryan's firm had offered resources beyond just capital, they brought in experts in everything from public relations to technology, all of whom were passionate about the mission. It felt like they were building something that would outlast the small community centers they had started with, something that could transform entire cities. Elon, ever the visionary, was already brainstorming how they could build digital resources for those who could not access physical centers. "We're talking about reaching the entire country, not just one town," he said one afternoon, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "If we nail this, we can help millions, not just thousands." Mr. Thompson wasn't used to such grand thinking. He had always been focused on one thing, the people in front of him. But the more he worked alongside Elon and Ryan's team, the more he started to see that the potential impact of the center could extend far beyond his original vision. Despite the excitement, the reality of expansion soon set in. The pressures of managing multiple centers were enormous. The task of keeping everything running smoothly felt overwhelming at times. But the new resources at their disposal gave Mr. Thompson a sense of hope. The dream wasn't over. It was just beginning. Late one evening, as he walked through the center, Mr. Thompson reflected on how far they had come. From a small, local idea to a growing network of centers, they had weathered many storms, and there would be more to come. But for the first time, he truly believed they had the tools, the vision, and the heart to go further. As he walked past the bustling activity, he caught sight of a child smiling as she sat at a computer learning about coding. A couple nearby was laughing as they picked out books from the free library. An elderly man was sitting quietly in a corner, chatting with one of the volunteers. This was why they did it. This was what kept them going. With new challenges ahead, Mr. Thompson knew they had only just scratched the surface of what they could achieve. And for the first time, he felt ready for what was coming next. As the partnership with Ryan's firm gained momentum, the first major test came unexpectedly. The initial excitement of bringing in new resources and expanding the community centers quickly gave way to a new set of challenges that Mr. Thompson had not anticipated. It wasn't just about scaling up operations, it was about staying true to their mission while navigating the pressures that came with growth. For weeks, everything seemed to be moving at a fast pace, plans were being drafted, new team members were being hired, and there was a buzz of activity as each center prepared for its expansion. But beneath the surface, doubts began to creep in. Mr. Thompson found himself facing internal conflict. As more people became involved, he wondered if they were losing the personal touch that had made the community centers so special in the first place. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Mr. Thompson sat at his desk, reviewing reports. The community centers had grown, but so had the complexities. The bigger the operation became, the harder it was to manage every detail. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered to himself, rubbing his temples. "I wanted to help people, not juggle spreadsheets and investor calls." Elon, who had been spending most of his time on other projects, dropped by to check in on how things were going. As soon as he saw Mr. Thompson's expression, he knew something was off. "Hey, what's going on? You look like you've been running a marathon," Elon said, sitting down across from his friend. Mr. Thompson sighed. "It's just a lot. The centers are growing, sure. But the more they expand, the harder it gets to keep the personal touch. The volunteer programs are overwhelmed, and I'm getting so many requests from people who want to help, but I don't know if I can manage it all." Elon leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. "You've done an incredible job so far. But you can't do this alone. And you can't hold on to everything. The bigger we grow, the more systems we need in place. And it's going to feel less personal at times, but that doesn't mean it's any less impactful." "I get that," Mr. Thompson replied, shaking his head. "But I want to make sure that the heart of this place doesn't get lost. We've always been about relationships, not just the services we provide." Elon nodded thoughtfully. "That's why you brought Ryan and his team in, right? To help with the infrastructure so that you can keep doing what you do best, building those relationships. They can handle the logistics while you focus on the people. It's the only way to scale and keep the mission intact." Mr. Thompson paused, considering Elon's words. Maybe he had been too caught up in the day-to-day struggles of expansion to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about managing the details. It was about finding the balance between growth and personal connection. The next morning, Mr. Thompson made a decision. He called a meeting with Ryan and his team to talk about the current situation. He needed to be sure that the structure they were building was one that would allow them to scale without losing their soul. Ryan and his team were receptive to the concerns, and they laid out a plan to address the challenges. "The centers are doing great," Ryan said, "but we need to streamline operations and bring in more leadership at the local level. The community managers need to have more autonomy so they can make decisions on the ground while still reporting to a central system." "I agree," Mr. Thompson said, nodding. "But we also need to make sure that the people we hire and promote share the same values. The centers have been built on trust and connection. I don't want to risk that." Ryan smiled. "Of course. We'll help you find the right people. The goal is to ensure you're not overwhelmed while maintaining the integrity of your vision. We can set up leadership training, improve communication between the centers, and even bring in more technology to help reduce the load on the team." Elon, who had been sitting quietly, added, "The tech side will help, too. We can use digital platforms to engage more people, but we need to make sure the physical presence is still strong. The key is to balance both worlds. Mr. Thompson left the meeting feeling somewhat relieved. There was a way forward, and it didn't mean abandoning the values that were important to him. As Ryan's team worked on refining the internal systems, Mr. Thompson began to focus on what he did best, working directly with the people in the centers. A few weeks later, the first major test came. One of the newly expanded centers faced an unexpected crisis. A storm had caused significant damage to the building, and the community was at risk of losing its gathering space just as the school year was about to begin. The situation was critical. Volunteers and staff were scrambling to get things back in order, but there was no time to waste. Mr. Thompson immediately jumped into action, organizing repair teams, reaching out to donors, and ensuring that displaced families had a place to go. It was a stressful time, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude that he had the resources to make a difference in the community. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had started the center in the first place. As the storm passed and the center was rebuilt, the local community showed their strength. Volunteers from all over came to help with cleanup, and local businesses donated materials and labor to restore the space. It was a collective effort. A reminder that, despite the growing complexity of the center's expansion, the heart of the operation was still deeply embedded in the community. That evening, as the dust settled and the center was once again functional, Mr. Thompson sat on the steps outside, watching the sun set. It had been a long day, but a meaningful one. The center had weathered the storm, literally and figuratively. And through it all, the people remained the heart of the operation. Elon arrived shortly after, bringing some much-needed coffee. "You did it," Elon said, handing Mr. Thompson a cup. "This could have been a huge setback, but you pulled through." "I couldn't have done it without the team, and without the community," Mr. Thompson replied, taking a sip of the coffee. "This place isn't just mine, it's ours." "You've built something remarkable here," Elon said, sitting down next to him. "And now it's about maintaining that strength while scaling it up. The community is what will keep it going, no matter how big it gets." Mr. Thompson nodded. The storm had been a test, but it had shown him that, no matter how big they grew, the essence of the community center would always be rooted in the people they served. They had weathered the storm together, and they would continue to face whatever challenges came next. The storm had passed, and with it, a sense of resilience that Mr. Thompson hadn't anticipated. The community had rallied around the center, proving to him that the heart of the mission was intact. The repairs were completed, and the center was once again a hub of activity, but something had shifted within him. The rapid growth and changes began to feel more like a double-edged sword. He spent late nights pacing, thinking about the crossroads ahead. Expanding had never been part of his original vision. What had started as a small, local effort to help people in need had snowballed into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The new centers were opening at a remarkable pace, and the systems Ryan's team had put in place were working. But as things grew, the more Mr. Thompson began to wonder if the essence of what they had built would be lost in the process. As much as he had welcomed the partnership with Ryan's firm, the more he looked at the numbers and projections, the more it seemed like their focus had shifted. There were conversations about profits, market reach, and scaling strategies, but little about the people they were serving. Was this the inevitable price of growth? Was the personal touch that had made the center special going to be lost in the process? One afternoon, after a series of strategy meetings, Mr. Thompson sat down with Elon at their favorite local cafe, a quiet spot where they could think and speak freely. The two of them had been through a lot together, and Elon always seemed to have a unique perspective on the challenges ahead. "I'm feeling overwhelmed, Elon," Mr. Thompson confessed, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this anymore. Everything is changing, and I don't want to lose what we built. It's hard to explain, but it feels like we're losing sight of the community." Elon leaned forward, his eyes focused and thoughtful. "I get it," he said, his voice calm. It's not easy when things grow quickly. But here's the thing, growth doesn't have to mean losing what's important. You've created something extraordinary here, and I believe there's a way to scale it up without losing that. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. How? It's hard to juggle all these moving parts and still make sure the people at the core of it all get the attention they need. I've been thinking about that too, Elon continued. The community is at the heart of this, but there's a bigger opportunity. We're not just expanding for the sake of growing. We're doing it to reach more people, to help more people. If we can keep the focus on that, the people who need us most, then the growth becomes a tool to amplify your impact. It's not about numbers. It's about connection. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath. Elon's words had a calming effect on him. It wasn't about choosing between growth and connection, it was about using the resources they had wisely to make a bigger difference. But that didn't make the decision any easier. The pressure was mounting, and he wasn't sure he was the one who could carry the weight of it all. The next day, Mr. Thompson found himself in another meeting with Ryan and his team. This time, the conversation was different. The focus was no longer just on the financial aspects of expansion. Instead, they discussed ways to ensure that the centers stayed rooted in their original mission. They spoke about building systems that allowed for more personal engagement, creating a platform for feedback from the communities they served, and making sure that no center was left behind. Ryan, who had been a strong advocate for rapid expansion, was now echoing the same sentiments Mr. Thompson had been struggling with. "You're right," Ryan said, nodding in agreement. "We've been so focused on scaling that we may have lost sight of the importance of maintaining the personal relationships. Let's find a way to incorporate that feedback more directly into our growth plans." "I think we need to bring the leadership back to the communities," Mr. Thompson replied. "I want each community center to be a reflection of the local people. We need leaders who know their neighborhoods, who understand the unique needs of each area. I don't want this to become a corporate model. It's about the people." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. The partnership with Ryan's team was far from over, but now there was a shared understanding, growth and community had to coexist. They would work to ensure that expansion didn't come at the cost of the personal touch that had made the centers so successful. As Mr. Thompson left the meeting, he felt a wave of relief. Maybe the answer wasn't to stop growing, but to find a balance, an approach that honored the roots of their mission while allowing for the change that was inevitable. It was going to be a challenge, but he was ready to face it. The weeks that followed were filled with strategic shifts. They implemented a feedback loop from each center, enabling volunteers, staff, and the people they served to directly influence decision-making. They began to recruit local leaders, people who understood the heart of the community, and ensured that they had the tools to succeed. It wasn't about pushing the center to grow faster, it was about ensuring that every center, no matter its size, could maintain its unique connection with the people it served. But the challenges didn't stop there. With growth came new hurdles, and the scale of the centers now meant that the need for resources and oversight was more critical than ever. Mr. Thompson was grateful for the partnerships, but at times it felt like they were walking a tightrope, balancing between ambition and the fear of losing sight of their original mission. One evening, Mr. Thompson was walking through one of the newly expanded centers when he noticed something different. There was a sense of calm among the volunteers, a warmth that reminded him of the early days. The children were playing, the elderly were engaged in a reading group, and families were gathering in the corner, talking and laughing. The center had weathered the storm, both literally and figuratively, and it was thriving. Elon was right. Growth didn't have to mean sacrifice. It was about using what they had learned to reach more people, while keeping the heart of the mission intact. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be bumps along the way, but Mr. Thompson now understood that the real work wasn't just about keeping the center running, it was about making sure the people they served never felt like they were forgotten. As the community centers continued to expand, the balance Mr. Thompson had worked so hard to maintain was put to the ultimate test. The systems were in place, the leadership team had been strengthened, and each center was thriving. The future looked bright, yet, as always, there was a storm on the horizon. It came in the form of an unexpected challenge, a threat that had nothing to do with the community center's expansion strategy, but everything to do with the people they served. It started as a whisper among the staff, a quiet murmur that quickly grew louder, creating tension throughout the network of centers. A few key volunteers, some of whom had been with Mr. Thompson since the very beginning, began to question the integrity of the expansion. The message was simple: what happened to the heart of the mission? Why does it feel like everything is turning into a business? Mr. Thompson first heard the rumblings through one of the senior volunteers, Elena, who had been with him from the start. Elena was someone who always spoke her mind, and when she asked for a private meeting, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. "It's about the new changes, Mr. Thompson," Elena said, sitting across from him in the small office he had made his home. "People are noticing that things are different. I know you're trying to grow, but I don't think everyone understands why it's happening so quickly." Mr. Thompson's heart sank. Elena had always been one of his most trusted allies, and hearing the concerns from her felt like a betrayal, even though he knew it wasn't. "I understand your concerns, Elena. But this growth is necessary. We can't help more people if we don't scale up." "It's not the growth that's the problem," she replied. "It's the way it's happening. People are feeling like they're being treated like numbers now. It used to be about the connections, about knowing every person who walked through the door. Now it feels like we're losing that, and the volunteers are getting burned out." Mr. Thompson sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't realized how much the shift had affected the volunteers, the very people who had helped him build everything. He had been so focused on the bigger picture that he had forgotten the small, crucial pieces that made it all possible. "I had no idea things had gotten so tense," Mr. Thompson finally said. "I thought we were managing it well, keeping everything aligned with our values." "I think people are worried about the direction we're heading," Elena said softly. "They don't want to lose the personal touch. They don't want to be just a cog in a machine. They want to know that they're still making a difference, not just checking off boxes for some corporate metric." Mr. Thompson felt a sharp pang of guilt. Elena was right. The mission had always been about more than just providing services. It was about connection, about being there for people in a way that was personal and meaningful. How had they gotten so far away from that? "You're right," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "I've been so focused on growth, on what comes next, that I didn't realize how much we might be losing in the process." Elena gave him a soft smile. "It's not too late to fix it. But we need to make sure we stay true to our roots. People need to feel valued. The volunteers need to feel like they're part of something bigger, something that still feels like a community, not a corporation." After their conversation, Mr. Thompson knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the mission falter, not now, not after everything they had built. But there was a part of him that feared that if he couldn't win back the loyalty of the core volunteers, everything might fall apart. The very next day, he organized a town hall-style meeting for all the staff and volunteers across the network of centers. He wanted to hear directly from them, to understand their concerns and to assure them that he had not forgotten the mission that had brought them together in the first place. As he walked into the conference room, filled with the familiar faces of volunteers, staff, and community leaders, Mr. Thompson felt the weight of the room's collective eyes on him. They were all waiting for answers, and he knew this was his moment to make things right. "I know many of you are feeling uncertain about where we're headed," Mr. Thompson began, his voice steady but laced with the emotion he was trying to keep in check. "The growth has been rapid, and I've focused so much on expanding that I may have overlooked the very thing that made this place special, the relationships." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I want to be clear. This mission was never about turning a profit or becoming some big corporation. It was about people. And if any of you feel that we've lost that, I'm truly sorry. It wasn't intentional, and I'm here today to listen." The room was quiet. People were looking at him, their faces filled with a mix of relief, hesitation, and uncertainty. Mr. Thompson could feel the tension, but he wasn't afraid. This was the moment of truth. He needed to hear what they had to say. One volunteer, a young woman named Sarah, raised her hand. "I think what we're all worried about is that it's becoming harder to make those personal connections. We're getting more people, sure, but we're also getting more rules, more reports, more expectations. And it feels like we're losing touch with the families we serve." Mr. Thompson nodded, understanding the concern. "I hear you, Sarah. And you're right. The changes have come fast, and we've had to implement new systems, but that doesn't mean we should sacrifice the heart of what we're doing. From here on out, we're going to focus on creating more opportunities for personal engagement. The systems we put in place should serve you, not take away from your work." The room murmured in agreement, the tension slowly beginning to lift. "I'm committing to making changes, Mr. Thompson continued, his voice firm but filled with resolve. "We will streamline the administrative processes, put more power in the hands of the local leaders, and ensure that every volunteer, every staff member, every person involved still feels the connection and the purpose that we started with." As the meeting came to a close, Mr. Thompson felt a sense of relief wash over him. The storm hadn't passed yet, but it was a good first step in regaining the trust and loyalty of those who had made the mission possible. Later that day, Elon stopped by to check in. "How did the meeting go?" he asked, his eyes scanning Mr. Thompson's expression. "We're not out of the woods yet," Mr. Thompson said, "but it went well. People are listening, and they're willing to work with us to make sure we don't lose what matters most." Elon smiled. "That's what matters. You'll get through this. You've always found a way." Mr. Thompson nodded, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, but at least now, he wasn't facing it alone. The days that followed the town hall meeting were filled with tension, but also a newfound sense of hope. The volunteers were starting to believe in the mission once again, and the leadership team was more unified than ever. The changes Mr. Thompson promised began to take shape, as the administrative load on the volunteers and staff was lightened, and more focus was placed on direct community involvement. But even with these positive steps, something still gnawed at him, a feeling that the trust that had once been abundant was now fragile, like a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. A few weeks after the meeting, Mr. Thompson was sitting in his office late at night, going over the latest financial reports. The growth was continuing, but there was still a noticeable dip in engagement across some of the newer centers. The numbers didn't lie, while more people were being reached, it wasn't clear whether the connection that had once defined the centers was still there. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. He heard a knock at the door and looked up to see Elena standing in the doorway, her usual stern expression softened by concern. "Got a minute?" she asked, stepping into the office without waiting for a response. Elena was no stranger to directness, and today, it seemed, was no different. "Of course," Mr. Thompson replied, gesturing for her to sit. He had known Elena long enough to know that when she came in with that look on her face, something serious was about to be said. "I've been hearing a lot of whispers again," she said, sitting across from him. "It's not the volunteers this time, it's the people. The families. The ones who have been here from the very start. They're feeling like they're being pushed aside." Mr. Thompson's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "We've been doing everything we can to listen and adjust. It's not enough, and they're starting to notice," Elena replied, her tone firm. "The people who helped build these centers, the ones who've been here for years, they feel like they're getting lost in the shuffle. They say the services are still great, but it doesn't feel like home anymore. They don't see themselves in this bigger operation." Elena's words hit harder than Mr. Thompson expected. He had been so focused on scaling the operation, so focused on growth, that he had neglected the very people who had made all of it possible in the first place. He thought about all the late nights he had spent strategizing, and the countless hours spent refining systems and processes, but none of it had mattered if it meant losing the heart of the centers. "I understand," Mr. Thompson said quietly. I thought the changes were going to make things better. But it seems like we're losing sight of what made this whole thing work in the first place. There's still time to fix it, Elena said. But we need to act fast. The community will forgive, but they won't forget. They need to feel like they're still a part of something. The people, the families, the volunteers, they're the foundation. And if we don't start putting them back at the center of everything we do, I'm afraid we'll lose them for good. Mr. Thompson sat back in his chair, lost in thought. Elena was right. The promise he had made to them, to keep the community at the heart of the mission, was being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. They had grown so fast, but the deeper challenge was figuring out how to scale with the people, not around them. After a few moments, Mr. Thompson made up his mind. I'll meet with the families, Elena. I'll sit down with them and hear what they have to say. I'm not going to wait for them to come to me. I'll go to them. Elena smiled, clearly relieved. That's a good start. They need to see that you're listening. They need to know that the mission hasn't changed, only the scale. Over the next few days, Mr. Thompson took Elena's advice to heart. He personally visited several community centers, taking time to speak with families, volunteers, and those they served. It wasn't enough to hear about the issues secondhand, he needed to feel the pulse of the community himself. What he found was eye-opening. The centers were still serving their purpose, but the personal connections were fading. It was as if the busy, bureaucratic systems in place were putting up walls between the people who mattered most and the staff who were meant to help them. Some families admitted they hadn't even seen the same volunteers they had come to trust, others said they felt like just another number in the system. But there was something else he discovered as well, something that gave him hope. The heart of the community was still beating, even if it was quieter than before. The people wanted to be involved, wanted to help guide the mission, but they needed to know that their voices mattered. Mr. Thompson spent several days talking to as many people as he could, gathering feedback and, most importantly, showing that he cared. He understood the magnitude of their feelings, and he was determined to do whatever it took to make things right. By the time he returned to his office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was clear to him now, they couldn't just grow for the sake of growing. They had to grow with the community, keeping the connection alive every step of the way. He sat down at his desk and began drafting an open letter to the entire network of centers. He promised to slow down the pace of expansion to focus on rebuilding the personal relationships that had made the centers great. He also pledged to implement regular feedback channels and ensure that the local leaders had the support and autonomy they needed to make the centers feel like home for everyone. The next morning, the letter went out, and the response was immediate. Volunteers, families, and staff members alike expressed gratitude for his transparency. They appreciated his honesty and his willingness to engage with them directly. But more importantly, they saw a leader who wasn't afraid to admit when things weren't working and who was ready to change course. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Elon reached out to him later that afternoon. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice warm with concern. "I think we're on the right path," Mr. Thompson replied. "I'm not going to lie, it's going to take time to rebuild trust. But I'm committed to doing whatever it takes." "That's what matters," Elon said. "Trust is everything, and you've got it in spades. Just keep doing what you're doing, and you'll get through this." As the weeks passed, things slowly began to improve. The centers felt more connected, more alive, as families and volunteers came together to shape the future. Mr. Thompson knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on the right path. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the number of centers. It was about the people, always had been, always would be. The weeks that followed Mr. Thompson's letter to the community were nothing short of transformative. As promised, he slowed the pace of expansion, turning his focus inward toward rebuilding the foundation of their mission. He knew it was not just about the people on the outside, the ones who walked into the centers seeking help, it was about the team who had poured their hearts into making the vision a reality, the volunteers, the families, and all the staff who had been there from the very beginning. A sense of rejuvenation spread through the centers. Volunteers began to feel heard again. Families felt seen. And, for the first time in months, there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. They were no longer part of a faceless organization, they were part of something personal, something meaningful, something they could be proud of again. But Mr. Thompson wasn't the only one who noticed the shift. Elon, too, saw it, albeit from a distance, as he continued with his own projects. He'd been following Mr. Thompson's progress closely, offering advice when asked, but he knew this journey was his friend's to make. That said, it wasn't just the centers that were transforming. Something deeper was happening. Mr. Thompson's relationship with the mission had changed, too. He wasn't just a leader anymore, he was a guide, a mentor. He had shed the weight of constant growth in favor of something more sustainable and profound. He had become someone who truly understood the balance between progress and preservation, between ambition and humility. One evening, as Mr. Thompson sat at his desk reviewing the feedback from the latest volunteer town hall, his phone buzzed. It was Elon. "Let's meet tomorrow," the text read. "I have something important to talk about." Curiosity piqued, Mr. Thompson replied with a simple, "See you then." The next morning, he met Elon at a small cafe in the heart of the city. The place was quiet, perfect for a conversation between two longtime friends who had shared their fair share of challenges and triumphs. Elon sat down across from him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I've been keeping an eye on things," he began. "And I'm impressed by the changes you've made." "Thanks," Mr. Thompson said, grateful for the praise, though he could feel there was more coming. "I've had to make some hard choices, but it feels like we're on the right path." "You are," Elon said, leaning forward. "But I think you're ready for something bigger. The foundation you've built here, the loyalty you've restored, it's a model for something far beyond these centers. You found the key to sustainable growth, the balance between progress and keeping the heart of the mission intact. That's rare, especially in an organization like yours." Mr. Thompson sat back in his chair, processing Elon's words. He had always known that the impact of the centers could go beyond just the local community, but hearing Elon say it out loud made the idea seem more real than ever before. "Are you saying I should expand even further?" Mr. Thompson asked, cautious but intrigued. "No," Elon replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm saying you need to start thinking about how this mission can impact the world. You've discovered something important, something that could revolutionize the way people think about community, charity, and giving. What if you could scale this in a way that didn't compromise what you've built?" The idea hung in the air between them, both exciting and terrifying at the same time. Mr. Thompson thought about it for a moment, wondering if he was truly ready to take that leap. "You think it's possible?" he asked quietly. Elon nodded. "I do. But you'll need to rethink your approach. The world doesn't need more nonprofits that function like businesses. It needs real solutions, people-centered solutions. You've learned how to keep that human element intact. Now, you need to show the world how it can work on a global scale." The conversation continued, as Elon mapped out his vision for Mr. Thompson, explaining how technology, partnerships, and grassroots movements could all come together to create a global community network, one that didn't just provide services but also empowered local leaders to make decisions that truly mattered to their communities. But even as the excitement began to build in Mr. Thompson, there was still a hesitation. This wasn't just about scaling up more centers, it was about fundamentally changing the way people engaged with charity and giving. It was about turning the idea of community service on its head. He paused, then asked, "What's the catch?" Elon chuckled. "There's no catch, but there's a cost. You'll have to put everything you've built to the test, your values, your relationships, and your trust in the people around you. This isn't something you can do alone. But you've already proven that you know how to build trust. You've already proven that you can turn things around when it seems impossible. Mr. Thompson sat quietly, the weight of the decision starting to settle in. This wasn't just another step in their journey, it was a turning point. A chance to make a difference on a scale he had never imagined. Elon smiled. Take your time. But know that when you're ready, I'll be here to help. As the conversation ended, Mr. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The mission was bigger than it had ever been, and with Elon's encouragement, he could see a way forward that could truly change the world. The next few days were filled with contemplation. Mr. Thompson knew that the centers had reached a critical point. He had seen firsthand how his approach had impacted not just the families and volunteers, but also the very fabric of the community. They had made a difference, but could they make a difference on a larger scale? Could they turn their success into a model that could be replicated everywhere? The answer was clear. It was time to take the next step. Not just for the centers, but for the entire world. Mr. Thompson spent the next few days reflecting on his conversation with Elon. The prospect of expanding beyond the local community, of transforming the work he had started into a global movement, was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The vision Elon had painted was ambitious, perhaps even audacious, but it struck a chord with him. He knew that the centers had created something special, something that had the power to change lives. But the idea of reaching people all over the world, of extending that same sense of connection and purpose to others who had never stepped foot in one of their centers, felt like a leap into the unknown. That night, as he sat alone in his office, Mr. Thompson pulled out a journal that he kept hidden away in the top drawer of his desk. It was full of notes, ideas, and reflections from years of work. He had used it to track the growth of the centers, to document the struggles, the triumphs, and the lessons learned along the way. But now, as he flipped through the pages, he began to see something else, a pattern, a blueprint for what could come next. He jotted down a few words: people-centered, community, trust, empowerment. These were the pillars that had shaped everything they had done. It was clear that these principles had to remain at the core of any future expansion. But how could they scale them while maintaining that deeply personal connection? How could they bring these values to places they had never reached before? He wrote down a new idea: what if we empower communities to lead the change? For years, Mr. Thompson had been the one to set the direction, to make the decisions, to implement the changes. But perhaps it was time to take a step back and let the people on the ground, the ones closest to the communities, take the lead. This was the key to true scalability, not forcing a one-size-fits-all solution, but allowing each community to shape its own path, guided by the same values they had established from the beginning. The next day, he called a meeting with his core team. Elena, who had been with him through the rough patches, was the first to arrive. He could see the curiosity in her eyes. She knew something important was coming. "Gather everyone," Mr. Thompson said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "I've been thinking a lot about where we go from here, and I believe it's time we take a new approach. Something that could change everything." Within the hour, the entire leadership team was gathered around a large conference table. Elena sat to his right, and the others filled the seats, their expressions a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath before speaking. "I know we've been focusing on growth, on expanding our reach to more people and opening more centers. But after everything we've been through, I've realized that growth isn't the only thing that matters. We need to be more intentional about how we scale." The room was silent as the weight of his words settled in. "For the past few months, we've been working to rebuild trust with the community, to re-establish the personal connections that make what we do so special. And that's what we have to focus on moving forward, keeping that sense of community at the heart of everything we do. But there's one more piece to this puzzle." He paused, allowing the tension in the room to build. "We need to shift from a model where we are the central authority to one where we empower the communities themselves to lead the way. We've always said that we're here to help, not to control. But now, I think we need to take that to the next level. Instead of opening more centers ourselves, let's create a system where local leaders in different regions can build their own centers, with our support but not our control. The room erupted into discussion. It was a bold idea, one that would require trust and collaboration on a scale they had never attempted before. There were concerns about consistency, about quality control, about how to ensure that the core values would remain intact. "I get it," Mr. Thompson said, raising his hand to bring the conversation to a halt. "It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way I see this working. If we want to make a true global impact, we have to give people the tools and the autonomy to create something that works for them. We can't expect the same model to work everywhere. Every community is different. We need to meet them where they are." Elena, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke up. "I agree with you. But we'll need to establish clear guidelines, a framework for support. We can't just throw people into this without the resources and training they need." "Of course," Mr. Thompson responded. "We'll provide the training, the resources, and the ongoing mentorship. But the leadership has to come from the community itself. We'll be their partners, not their bosses." It was clear that this vision wasn't going to be easy. There would be hurdles, financial, logistical, and cultural. But something about it felt right. The center's mission had always been about empowering individuals, and this new model would allow them to do that on a global scale. The team spent the rest of the day hashing out details. They discussed the framework they would need to build, how they would identify and train local leaders, and how to create a system of support that was scalable without compromising their values. There were still many unanswered questions, but for the first time in months, Mr. Thompson felt a surge of excitement. This was the future. It wasn't just about helping people, it was about changing the way the world thought about community service. By the time the meeting wrapped up, Mr. Thompson felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew this was the right direction. They weren't just going to expand their mission, they were going to transform it into something that could spread to every corner of the globe. He couldn't do it alone. But with the support of his team, with the right partnerships and resources, he believed they could build something bigger than anything he had ever imagined. It was time to take the leap. The decision to scale their mission globally came with a rush of excitement, but soon after, reality set in. Mr. Thompson and his leadership team had laid the groundwork, but the next step was daunting. They had to transition from a local organization to a global movement. It wasn't just about expanding, it was about maintaining their core values while being flexible enough to adapt to the diverse needs of communities across the world. The task felt monumental, and the challenges seemed endless. The first challenge was finding the right leaders. Mr. Thompson and his team needed to identify individuals who had not only the passion for the mission but also the vision to lead their own centers with the same integrity and commitment that had been at the heart of their success so far. These leaders had to be empowered to run their own local initiatives, but they needed the tools, resources, and training to ensure they didn't stray too far from the organization's founding principles. "We can't just pick anyone," Elena said during one of their strategy meetings. "We need people who understand the value of community building, people who are invested in their local areas and who are willing to fight for change. But they also need to be leaders, capable of inspiring and organizing others. They'll have to understand the nuances of their own cultures and adapt the framework to fit those needs." Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully, the weight of the decision resting heavily on his shoulders. "That's why we need to focus on communities that are ready for this change. We need to find those local leaders who already have the respect and trust of the people around them. That's the first step." The next few months were filled with travel and meetings. Mr. Thompson and his team traveled across the globe to scout potential centers, identify local leaders, and observe the conditions in different regions. They faced cultural differences, logistical obstacles, and financial barriers at every turn. Each new community came with its own unique set of challenges: economic instability, political unrest, and varying levels of infrastructure. It became clear that the mission they had started could not be replicated in the same way everywhere. They would have to adapt and innovate constantly. One of the most difficult parts of the process was realizing that not all communities were ready for this kind of transformation. In some places, the groundwork for change had not yet been laid. In others, the local needs were so specific that a one-size-fits-all solution simply wouldn't work. They had to rethink their approach, tailoring it to each community while staying true to their mission. "We've had to learn to be flexible," Mr. Thompson said to Elena as they sat in a cafe after a particularly challenging meeting in a rural village in Africa. "In some places, they're ready to move forward, but in others, we're still laying the groundwork. It's not easy, but we can't rush this. If we push too hard, too fast, we risk losing what makes this work." Elena agreed. "It's a delicate balance, isn't it? We can't let the urgency of our vision overshadow the real needs of these communities. They're not just part of a project, they're people with their own lives and struggles. We have to be patient." Throughout these months of travel, they met extraordinary individuals, local leaders who were already doing incredible work on the ground, often with very little resources. They saw firsthand the resilience of communities that had been left behind, who had been told for years that they didn't matter. These people were the heart of the mission, and it became clearer each day that their success would depend not just on the global framework they were building but on how well they could foster and nurture these local leaders. Back at headquarters, the team was working tirelessly to build a support structure that could sustain these leaders once they were trained and empowered. They developed mentorship programs, resource libraries, and leadership development tools to ensure each center had the right support. But they also realized that the local leaders would need to be given the autonomy to make decisions for their own communities, not just follow a set of rules dictated from afar. It was a lesson in trust, trusting that the leaders they were empowering knew their communities better than anyone. Trusting that the mission, rooted in the principles of love, service, and empathy, would continue to guide them. And above all, trusting that the foundations they had laid in their original centers would hold steady as they expanded globally. Despite the many setbacks and obstacles, there were moments of triumph. In some places, local leaders had already begun to adapt the model in ways that were both innovative and deeply rooted in the culture of their community. In South America, for example, a small center that had been struggling financially found a way to make their program self-sustaining by partnering with local businesses to provide job training and microloans. In Asia, a group of volunteers had started a network of women's groups that supported each other, sharing resources, knowledge, and mentorship, in ways that Mr. Thompson had never imagined. These moments, small as they were, reminded him why this mission mattered. However, not every story was one of success. There were times when things didn't go as planned. Centers failed. Local leaders burned out. Cultural missteps created tension. There were moments of doubt, times when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But these setbacks only strengthened their resolve. It was at this moment that Mr. Thompson received a message from Elon. The tech mogul had been keeping tabs on the progress of the global initiative and had seen both the victories and the challenges that had come with it. The message was brief, but the words were exactly what Mr. Thompson needed to hear. "The road ahead is never straight, but it's the bumpy paths that lead to the greatest breakthroughs. You're doing incredible work. Keep going." Those words felt like a lifeline. As the months passed, the global initiative began to gain momentum. New centers opened in remote villages, in bustling cities, in countries across every continent. The mission had found its rhythm, adapting, changing, and growing in ways that were beyond Mr. Thompson's wildest dreams. But with every step forward, the mission became more than just about helping those in need. It became a movement rooted in the power of community, the strength of leadership, and the belief that when people are given the right resources and the right trust, they can change the world. As the team gathered to celebrate the opening of the 100th center, Mr. Thompson looked around the room at his colleagues, his friends, his partners in this incredible journey. They had come so far. And yet, he knew that this was just the beginning. He had taken the leap. And though the path ahead would never be easy, he was more certain than ever that this mission was the key to changing the world. As the days passed and the global expansion of the centers reached new heights, Mr. Thompson found himself reflecting on the incredible journey he had embarked on years ago. What had started as a small, local initiative had blossomed into a movement that spanned continents. What had begun as a mission to empower a few individuals had transformed into a global network of communities, all united by the shared belief that people, given the right tools and support, could change their own lives, and in turn, change the world. But as he stood at the podium at the grand opening of the 200th Center, it hit him, this wasn't just about growth anymore. It wasn't just about opening more doors, reaching more people, or building more programs. It was about something deeper, a legacy. The grand opening was a celebration of a monumental milestone. Hundreds of local leaders had gathered in one of the world's largest cities, joining hands with the central team to mark the occasion. As he looked out over the sea of faces, a mix of excitement and pride filled his chest. These were the people who had led the charge, who had taken the model and adapted it to fit their own unique communities. These were the ones who had kept the mission alive, who had given everything to the cause. And yet, in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but think of the countless others who had never been seen, the people who would never be on the stage, the ones working tirelessly behind the scenes, giving their all to something greater than themselves. Elon said it best, Mr. Thompson said into the microphone, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. This movement is more than just about us, the people in this room. It's about all of you, the leaders, the volunteers, the community members, and the families who've put their hearts into this work. It's about building something that lasts beyond our time. And that's what we're here for today, to celebrate what we've built together, and to look ahead at what's possible in the future. A wave of applause erupted from the audience, their cheers echoing through the hall. But as Mr. Thompson stood there, basking in the celebration, he thought of the future. He thought of how far they had come and how much further they could go. The next phase of the journey wasn't about simply expanding further, it was about deepening their impact, ensuring that every community, no matter where they were, had the ability to not only survive but thrive. And that meant continuing to invest in the leaders who had proven themselves to be capable of affecting change, continuing to build systems that supported long-term sustainability, and continuing to adapt and innovate based on the lessons they had learned. He thought of the local janitor who had first inspired this entire journey. The quiet, humble man who had worked for decades in the same high school, who had embodied the values of service and dedication long before the world knew his name. It was his quiet perseverance that had sparked a fire in Mr. Thompson's heart, a fire that had led to this moment. The janitor had been a reminder that every individual had the potential for greatness, and that greatness didn't need to be flashy or loud. It didn't need to be recognized by the world. It simply needed to be rooted in love and service to others. As the celebration continued, Mr. Thompson took a moment to step away from the crowd and look out over the city. The skyline stretched out before him, a testament to human achievement. But what truly stood out to him in that moment was the realization that the work was no longer his alone. It was theirs. Every leader, every volunteer, every person who had ever given their time, energy, or resources to the cause now had ownership over it. The mission had become a collective effort, a force that couldn't be stopped. His thoughts turned to the future of the initiative. He knew the world was changing rapidly, technologically, socially, and economically. There would always be new challenges, new hurdles to overcome. But there was something timeless about the mission they had created. The human spirit, when empowered, was unstoppable. As he walked through the halls of the new center, which would soon open its doors to thousands of people, Mr. Thompson felt a sense of fulfillment he had never imagined possible. This wasn't just about helping others, it was about creating a system where people could help themselves. It was about building a world where individuals didn't have to wait for someone else to change their circumstances, they could change them themselves, with the right resources, guidance, and community support. The final piece of the puzzle was coming together. Years ago, when he first started this journey, he couldn't have imagined how it would all unfold. He had been unsure of his own ability to make a lasting difference. But now, standing on the threshold of an unstoppable movement, he realized that this journey wasn't just his. It was everyone's. And it would live on long after he was gone. As he looked up at the sky, the horizon glowing with the colors of the setting sun, Mr. Thompson felt a deep peace. The work would continue, led by the people who believed in it most. The mission had gone full circle, from one man's dream, to a global movement, to a legacy of empowerment. It had all started with a simple question: what if we could change lives by believing in people? And now, the answer was clear: we already have. The world was a different place now. It was better. Stronger. More connected. And all because a janitor, in a quiet corner of the world, had inspired one man to see the greatness in others. The legacy of that belief would never fade. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?